Bloodshed provides forgiveness for sins? The New Testament promotes a very bloody definition of forgiveness by implying that forgiveness comes at a cost or that it requires a price to be paid. Yet, this is not forgiveness at all, is it? If somebody had to pay, it cannot be called forgiveness. Furthermore, Christianity made a big change to how God provides forgiveness for sins. It is not rooted in Jewish theology, but rather pagan. Many early pagan cultures believed that a human, preferably perfect and unblemished, must be sacrificed in place of everybody else. They were known to have sacrificed virgin daughters or firstborn sons, among others. So common was this theology among pagans that in the Old Testament, God actually commanded Abraham to sacrifice his own son Isaac before calling out a bluff the last minute. You see, Jews have always rejected these awful practices, while Christianity makes a return to this pagan ideology. In the New Testament we read, "Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness." However, here is what the Jews have always taught on the subject of forgiveness. In the Old Testament book of Ezekiel, we read, "If the wicked man turns from all his sins which he has committed, and observes all my statutes and practices, justice and righteousness, all his transgressions which he has committed will not be remembered against him." In other words, for a Jew, a sin sacrifice means something completely different from that of other pagan or Christian traditions. The Jews taught that sacrificing is nothing more than a symbol. It is comparable to me bringing flowers to my wife when I know I have done something terribly wrong. If I come to my wife and only say, "I'm sorry," that doesn't have as much conviction as bringing her flowers, getting on my knees, and tearfully asking for forgiveness. The flowers are a symbol of how sorry I truly am. In the Old Testament, a sin sacrifice is this same idea. Forgiveness is not in the sacrifice itself. That's ridiculous. But is us coming to God or our wife with flowers, getting on our knees, and saying, "I'm sorry." It is a sorry heart and the internal change we make within ourselves that provides true forgiveness, just as Ezekiel 18 stated so elegantly. If we don't feel sorry and don't make changes, but rather continue to hurt our wife again and again, the flowers mean nothing. In fact, they are an abomination. Ecclesiastes says, "To offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know they are doing evil." Furthermore, Jews have never even taught that bloodshed is a requirement for our forgiveness. The Old Testament explains this clearly when it tells us that if we do not have a blood sacrifice, we can provide a grain sacrifice. In other words, if you can't afford to bring your wife flowers, you can bring her some chocolate or maybe a card. God just wants to see us change, grow, and become virtuous. Christians have returned to the pagan way, concerning themselves less with their continuance of sin by believing that God has provided a scapegoat and that Jesus' blood sacrifice covers them. It's more like an insurance plan or a get-out-of-jail-free card. It is not Jewish. In fact, Jews have often stated how Christian theology can be dangerous and creates spiritual laziness. The Apostle Paul is arguably the greatest architect of Christian theology. Paul teaches that salvation is a free gift, if only you accept, and that we cannot earn forgiveness. There is nothing you can do. Otherwise, Jesus died for nothing. Most Christians will agree with Paul in how there is a problem with earning their reward. However, any honest person should be able to recognize a multitude of issues associated with a free gift of salvation. For one, free is not as appreciated as earned. For example, if people are given an Olympic gold medal for no reason, will they feel very proud wearing it around? Would they experience the same pleasure compared to that of the person who actually trained their entire life, worked their way up through thousands of competitions, and stood on the center pedestal while the gold medal is placed around their neck? Of course not. There is no comparison. Handing out gold medals to people who did not earn them is void of all and any valor or virtue. Yet Christians have taken this approach with salvation. In Christianity, you can perform a deathbed confession, and no matter how you lived your life, you will receive the ultimate and grand reward. In fact, from the Apostle Paul's point of view, we are completely helpless and cannot grow closer to God through our own efforts. This blood sacrificial theology is where Jews and Christians make their first big split, with Jews arguing how Christians are misrepresenting the entire point of life, and because of this free gift ideology, many Christians have become spiritually lazy, perhaps even most of them. Now, of course, we can't say all Christians are spiritually or morally lazy. That would be unfair. But I am absolutely certain we all know a Christian who is affected by this mindset. They know clearly when something is wrong or immoral, yet have no problems participating. They have an inerrant sense that they are not measured by their works or integrity, but rather whether or not they have accepted Jesus. This is enough for them. Christians will often talk as though this life is not their home, and that they are just doing time, waiting for Jesus and their reward. However, this concept of a reward for believing in a Messiah or a perfect heaven does not exist anywhere in Jewish text. In fact, the Christian idea of a heaven and a hell are also pagan concepts adopted by Christianity. Jews believe this life has ultimate purpose, having nothing to do with a final reward, and they do not frighten people by teaching that all unbelievers are condemned to hell. That's why Jews never proselytize. It's an absurd ideology. Therefore, proselytizing is strictly against Jewish religion. Why would God care if people from South America believed in him or not? Contrary to Christian theology, Jews believe that this life is a necessary process for the spiritual growth of all people. We are all here for the same reason, regardless of what God you believe in. Just imagine what it would be like if we lived in a world where there was no temptations. We could never achieve or overcome adversity. Being in these physical bodies that are so competitive and so easily led astray is the entire point of life. If there was no difficulty in being good, what virtue would there be in doing good? A wise God would understand how important it is to be in a world where these dangers exist. We need challenges, temptations, and obstacles. If Christians are simply given a reward by choosing the correct God, and without earning it, it's spiritually unhealthy. I do not envy Christians who say things like, "I know I'm saved," or "I've already won. I have a guaranteed spot on the bus." If God's true purpose for our life is to work and improve ourselves, it might be a catastrophe to sit back and say, "I've already made it to the top of the mountain." A Jewish rabbi by the name of Michael Skobac painted a perfect analogy for this. He said, imagine someone saying they're going to do something challenging and deeply rewarding. They're going to climb Mount Everest. It will be a difficult and exuberating journey. Let's say that they get halfway up, and someone comes by in a helicopter and says, "Come on in, I will take you to the top." Is this really helpful for this person? Is it a great thing for him to say, "I'm at the top"? Is that what it's all about? Is that the goal? Just to be at the top of the mountain? Or is the goal rooted in the journey itself? The difficult climb upwards. Being able to say, "I made it to the top." Rabbi Skobac stated so perfectly, if there is purpose or reason for our lives, I believe that Christians are missing the entire point of the journey. Furthermore, the Christian's version of a blood sacrifice is an absurdity. We now recognize it as scapegoating. Scapegoating is no longer practiced within today's social standards, as we now realize how gruesome, illogical, and unjust it truly is. To help you understand just how awful this theology is, I will play out a pretend scenario. Imagine for a moment that you are a mother of a 10-year-old boy who was brutally tortured, raped, and murdered by a middle-aged man named Steve. You're in the courtroom during trial as this man, Steve, who tortured and killed your son, is on the stand. The judge says, "Bring in my son, Bobby." Bobby is the perfect, innocent child who has never done anything wrong in his life. Bobby agrees to sacrifice his own life for Steve. Bobby is tortured and killed right there in the courtroom. The judge then turns to Steve and says, "All you have to do is accept, love, and honor Bobby's life, and you will be set free with a promise of great reward." Steve happily accepts Bobby's sacrifice. You are watching in absolute horror as Steve scapegoats from the responsibility of your son's torture, rape, and murder, and walks off in a blissful release. You are now horrified and completely dumbfounded. You yell out into the courtroom as loud as you can, "How is this justice? This is absurd." This pretend enactment actually mirrors how Jesus' sacrifice actually works. Scapegoating from accountability and punishment is not only outrageously demented, but leads to a host of illogical problems, which I cover in detail in part 1 and 2 of this video. Also stay tuned for part 4, where I discussed just how sinister this theology truly is. Stay strong and wise, my friends.
I don't believe in masquerades. I don't believe that you're okay. I don't believe that God will save. Only you can solve your problems. I don't care what they sow.